Welcome, everyone. We'll give just a minute while the room fills up here. I know we've got over 200 people participating, so I want to make sure that participant list climbs up a little bit before we kick it off. Well, it looks like we stalled at about 119, so maybe we had some wishful thinking registrants there, and that's okay. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I want to thank everybody for participating in our Grow Native Southwest Illinois Native by Design Digging into Your 2021 Garden Part 2 webinar. Another great turnout tonight. So this workshop series temporarily takes the place of our annual spring workshop, and we're as anxious as everybody to get back to our in-person events, so stay tuned for more updates on that. If you've attended our previous two webinars, this one is just going to be just a little bit different. Instead of a Q&A free-for-all, we're going to try to structure the presentation a bit around a few subtopics. And each presenter will give a 5-ish minute presentation on a subtopic related to early season garden maintenance. And after each short presentation, we'll do a 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A around that particular subtopic. So if you have questions that are of a more general nature, go ahead and save those for the end of the presentations, when we'll set aside the last 20 minutes or so for that kind of general Q&A. So our subtopics for tonight are going to be, spring cleaning, chemical versus natural treatments. Is that a native or a weed? Starting from seed or transplanting, when and how to do that, and managing the changing shape of your garden. So for a couple of housekeeping items here, we'll ask you to use the Q&A function for asking questions of the panelists. And so that's different from the chat function. So use the Q&A function for the questions for the panelists, and we'll have folks monitoring that for answering. And we know you're excited to chat about native plants, so if you could use the chat function if you want to share experiences amongst yourselves, amongst other audience members. I want to thank Grow Native, of course, for working with us and sponsoring this event. And then we've got a list here of our other sponsors. Also want to thank our committee members, many of whom are on the call tonight, but the ones who aren't panelists, Virginia Wolf Biley, we've got the Heartlands Conservancy, Brooke Widmar, who is our Zoom host tonight, and several others that I may be just blanking on the names of right now. Also just wanted to do a quick announcement that if you're in the Alton area, this Saturday, March 27th, there will be a seed swap at the National Great Rivers Research and Education Center down on the riverfront there, on the berm next to the Great Rivers Museum. And that's being sponsored by the Sierra Club, and that'll be from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. So with that said, I'd like to give a quick introduction of our panelists tonight. We've got Charlie Pitts, master naturalist and volunteer with several organizations in Illinois and Missouri. We've got Christine Favilla from the Sierra Club and Three River Project Coordinator, the co-founder of Community Cultivators and involved in several native planting projects, including Hellrung Park, Alton YWCA and Alton Middle School. Trevor Bennett from Pure Air Natives, former student at Lewis and Clark Community College in the Restoration Ecology program, and is the project ecologist for DJM Ecological and the inventory manager for Pure Air Natives. And then finally, Scott Moss, who is the coordinator of Restoration Ecology at Lewis and Clark Community College. So with that said, I'd like to kick it over to our first speaker, who is Charlie Pitts, who's going to be talking about spring garden cleanup. Go ahead, Charlie. And if you want to hit share, go ahead and do that.
I'm working on it.
All right.
And the question is, can you see that nice rake down there? Is that everybody seeing that?
I can. Are you in full screen? Are you in present mode there?
No, I'm not. At least I don't think I am, but
I can still see it nice and big. Okay, it looks like folks can see it.
let's see. Is that better?
No, that's a little worse.
Okay, let's see if I can figure out how to go back.
Yeah, I think if you just go back to where you had it. There you go.
Okay, so we're talking about garden cleanup. It is getting on to be spring and everybody wants to get outside in the nice weather, although right at the moment it's a little on the wet side. So if we want to garden with nature instead of just gardening for ourselves, let's talk about the whys, when, and hows of spring cleanup such that we work with nature. First of all, we really want to get out and get into nature and get out there and clean up some stuff. But here's a fact. Nature really doesn't need cleaning up. This Christmas fern is quite happy popping up through all the litter. So's the hairy cocoon through the grass out in the prairie. May apples, spring beauties, they're all popping up without any help of anybody cleaning any leaves or anything off, which kind of is a clue to gardeners that this may not be necessary. Secondly, if we clean up a little early, we remove a bunch of stuff that the birds are eating, particularly at this time of spring. There's not a lot left for them to eat because there's not a lot of new stuff growing. So they're kind of relying on some of the older stems and seeds that were around. At least they're around if we have delayed cleaning in the fall until spring. As black-capped chickpeas on yarrow, and oh yeah, sunflower seeds of the red-bellied woodpeckers. So these seeds, these end of season, early spring seeds are vitally important both to the birds that overwinter in the area throughout the year and on the arriving migrants who are just coming in and are desperately hungry because they have been flying a long distance. So if there's nothing for them to eat, their probability of surviving through the springtime with nestlings is slim. So let's talk about sharing stuff, sharing your yard. The vast majority of butterflies, moths, bees, etc., they overwinter here. Where do they overwinter? They're in leaf litter or in the dirt just below that. They're in hollow stems. They're in dead trees or snags or underneath barks and rocks. If you go cleaning all these leaves and litters and stems, it removes this coming summer's butterflies, bees, moths, and other critters. And because that's what those birds feed their young, it also reduces birds' nesting success. So there's some real good reason to delay your cleanup of the garden, because birds, in all that litter, they hunt and find stuff to keep themselves alive. So this winter garden feeds both the birds, provides protection to pollinators and food for birds. This garden plot definitely does not. But I want to make it clear, this is not an either or. On the left, you see a very clean garden spot with all the stuff removed. And on the right, you see another area that has had stuff left for all the critters and the birds to hunt in during the winter. And in reality, it's the same spot. Just one side where it's near the yard is nice and clean for the annuals and other plants that my wife grows, early spring plants. In the center, we have stuff that will be cleaned out in about another month or so once the grass gets growing. So why leave the leaves? Well, first of all, it insulates the soil. It keeps it a little warmer. It helps retain soil moisture. It releases nutrients for the plants as it decays. And something from a gardening perspective, it thwarts weed growth. Weed seeds, particularly annual weeds, need direct sunlight and to be on the ground. So if they're in below those leaves, they're not getting direct sun, and it's going to reduce the amount. Plus, you don't have to mulch as much because, I mean, the leaves are already there. And by the way, for those of us that are, this is my trombone year, 76, so to speak. Aches and pains are reduced significant. So when do you do it? Well, wait until the ground is dry. Don't walk on wet ground. Compaction is a gardener's worst enemy, as it is the farmers in the field. And the plants will tell you when they're ready. They begin to pop up and they say, hey, I'm starting to grow some grasses. And some leaves are coming online there. And as you can see in this, the guys are cutting off the old stems from last year. And that's an important point. Cut. Don't pull those stems and weeds. 2 reasons. When you pull the stems, you may pull out some of that plant and reduce its viability as you pull out some of the crown. The other thing is you're going to pull up some dirt and you're going to expose some new weed seeds. So you're going to contribute to the weeds that you're attempting to get rid of. So cut. And in fact, cutting back on the cutting back is important. Here's a great sign. Leaving 15 inches of last year's plant stems provide nesting habitats for insects and bees. Do they really use that? I don't know. You know, they may really use that. In fact, of the 2,000 species of bees native to North America, 500 are native in Illinois, 450, and 30% of those nest in stems and barks, etc. So it's very important to leave nesting grounds, nesting sites for these. So leave the leaves. It feeds the birds. It homes butterflies, bugs, and bees. It discourages weeds. Leave the stems until the plants tell you they're ready, and leave little short standing stems for the bees and bugs. Nathan, back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Charlie. And so now we'll take some questions. I should have been clear before. You're free to type those questions in the Q&A during that presentation. We've got a couple people. The other panelists can help to address those questions while our presenter's talking. But I just wanted to note we may not get to those until the end of the presentation, but you're free to put those in there whenever you want. And so far, I do not see any additional ones. Maybe we'll give it another minute. Here we go. Now they're coming. So I got one here, Charlie. What should we do with the stems that we cut? Throw them back in the garden?
It depends. If the plant looks like it had disease on it, then you should take them out and put it in do not compost them, put them somewhere else. On the other hand, if they're we're looking fairly healthy, you can just leave them where they are. If it offends your gardening sense, you can certainly remove them, but there's no need to do that whatsoever.
All right. Next one from Sherry Ann Cordover is, I've heard that stems need to be left for 2 winters for the nesting bees. Is that true?
The information I have is that once a stem is used by a bee, it is not reused later on. So it's probably a 1-year cycle. I will look that up, and if I find something different, I'll get back to you.
All right. Now we've got a few popping up in the chat here, which is fine. We'll get to those too, but just folks, if you would try to keep those questions to our panelists in the Q&A, so we've got them all in one spot. But we got one here is it better to cut plants back to 15 inches at what time of year, or is it better to just leave all full until cleanup time late spring?
Well, I think the best answer is leave it until spring cleanup. I'm a lazy gardener. I don't like cleaning up in the fall. I'd rather, get a last barbecue in rather than clean up. So if you leave them, you can do it in the springtime. And so that's what I would do springtime. Probably another 2 weeks or so. Certainly by the 1st of May, sometime would be probably the last time you need to do that.
Okay, and then the next one is, sorry, where'd we go here? When's the best time to touch up mulching?
Well, if you're going to mulch, I think springtime is a better time to mulching. I'm not an expert in the area, but we do springtime mulch. But when you're mulching, if you have the opportunity, leave some clear ground space, because those 70% of bees and wasps and one thing or another that live in the ground, they can't live in mulch, or they can't dig through mulch. So I would suggest that spring, and then leave a few ground spots. You may have to fight the weeds a little bit, but the bees will thank you.
All right. And I think that brings us to, one more. Do insects shelter in non-native plants or only in natives?
I think they'll shelter in pretty much anything that's available. So in both non-native and native plants, of course, the overall benefit of native plants as far exceeds that of non-native, but yeah, they will winter. It's any port in a storm. So yeah, I'll do a Mexican sunflower or whatever. All
right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of these questions. And folks, just remember, if you have more on this subtopic, we'll leave some space open at the end here for you to bring those back up. But at this time, I'd like to toss it over to Trevor Bennett. And Trevor, do you want to share your screen, or you want me to pull mine back up? Oh, you're on mute, Trevor.
Got it. Sorry. Force of habit. All right. Let's get to where I have it. If
you just want to go full screen, we should be good.
All right.
Floor is yours.
Waiting for it to load on mine. All right. You guys see that all right? Okay, so my topic is going to be on herbicide and stewardship, using herbicide in particular in ground preparation and managing native plant communities. I know a lot of people have kind of sorted feelings about herbicides, but they can be, if used effectively and responsibly, one of your best tools in your arsenal for integrated pest management and preparing an area for both seed or plants. So ground preparation is, in my experience, one of the areas that's most overlooked when it comes to planning. People want to pick their plant palette, and they want to, pick out where everything's going to go, and they have an idea, and they kind of glaze over the fact that there were plants that existed here before. Most of the time, they're non-native plants, in particular turf areas, and cool season grasses can be really detrimental to an establishing native planting. All right, so here is a general sequence for how to prepare the ground. Generally, I say delineate and identify, and clearly identify your area for treatments and plantings, along with target species for herbicide application. Herbicides are not all broad spectrum, they're specialized, and when you gear the herbicide towards your target species, you generally have a much better outcome than if you approach with the same chemical each time. In fact, that can be detrimental in the long run because certain weeds can form herbicide resistance. First spray, and then basically you're going to want to wait for your re-interval period and observe and see what comes back. If necessary, you can apply again. Most turf conversions will take 2 applications of herbicide. After that, one of the biggest, and most overlooked steps is to eliminate thatch layer, particularly with seed. Native seeds also need to have seed to soil contact. If they don't have seed to soil contact, you're just laying them out there as expensive bird feed. All right, here's a general timeline from install preparation to the first year of seeding. If you can see that, we're kind of in that March period right here. Your first herbicide application should be coming up if you're planning on converting an area. In particular, glyphosate needs a 50 degrees Fahrenheit for efficacy. Some actual organic chemicals like ammoniated soap of fatty acids can be used in cooler weather with the spring green up. However, that just burns the above ground biomass off. The second herbicide application should be well after. Generally, you can do 2 with about 2 weeks between, depending on the chemical. I like to give a growing season to see what's going to come up because right now we're just looking at cool season turf grasses, not some of the annual weeds that could pop up later in the year. The 2 best times to plant live plants, and from what I've experienced, are going to be in the early fall months or the kind of late spring, mid to late spring months when you have adequate moisture and relatively stable temperatures, where you don't have to worry about the plant drying out. You also don't have to worry about a hard freeze that's going to frost heap the plant out of the ground. If you're planting seed, kind of do it between those 2 periods. November through, I would say, no later than mid-May. Then, most people don't think of mowing as a stewardship for gardens, but if you do have annual weeds that are starting to canopy over some of your plants, you can cut them back, and many plants will even develop more flowers because of it. All right, so this is the analogy everybody in the prairie loves. This is the development of native plant communities. Sleeps, creeps, and leaps. The 3 years. Over these 3 years, you can expect to use a variety of different herbicides. The first year, you're going to be fighting a lot of annual weeds. This is where it's critical to have that ground development done. Generally, most of the time, we're going to use glyphosate as a general ground prep. And then, as you see what develops with your prairie, you can specialize the herbicides more. Okay. Uh-oh, let me go back. All right. So, know your enemy. The dose makes the poison. These are a couple commonly used chemicals, and this is just an example of how specialized these chemicals can be. 2,4-D is used for control on broadleaf weeds. You can use higher rates of control if you're trying to suppress perennials. However, it is a volatile chemical, so it's something that's got a very limited window. You don't want to use it in high wind. You also don't want to use it over about 85 degrees. If you have woody plants, like blackberries or something that you're trying to remove that have encroached in an area and you're trying to, put other native flowers back in there. don't try and spray it with glyphosate, because chances are glyphosate's not going to be effective against it. It's just going to kind of laugh at you and you know, come back stronger than ever. Triclopyr is used for woody stems, and it tends to be a lot more effective towards controlling these more perennial woody stemmed plants. The other thing that is commonly used, particularly with, like, let's say buffalo grass lawn, if you're doing a turf conversion, I know we don't, you know, sometimes it gets clustered with other types of plantings, but you know, this is also another type of native planting that's growing in popularity. Quinclorac is a chemical that's very effective in helping establish warm season grasses, mostly because it helps control a lot of annual grasses that can encroach and outcompete, you know, the perennial warm seasons. Drive Accelerate is one brand name that's frequently used in buffalo grass and blue grama establishment. All right, I labeled this slide Surfactants for Success because this is one thing that is frequently overlooked with the use of herbicides. Surfactants are something that help your herbicide actually become much more effective. In fact, many herbicides like chlorosulfuron actually require a non-ionic surfactant for it to be effective at all. So one of the ones that I use most frequently is methylated seed oil, also called bean oil. This just helps it stick to the plant and makes it a little bit more water safe, so that you get better absorption rates. It also helps increase your, you know, the lack of volatility with some chemicals. The other thing to consider is your water type when using that. If you have hard water and you're going to spray glyphosate will bond with calcium and magnesium and decrease the efficacy of that chemical uptake, you know, greatly. So consider adding something like ammonium sulfate to help, you know, bond up some of those, you know, molecules that might decrease the efficiency of your chemical. Identification and benchmarks. This is just saying, you know, identify your native plant species, but also identify your weeds. It's just as important to know your weeds as it is to know your native species in a planting, particularly when you're planning your stewardship. There's a lot of resources out there on the internet that you can use to help identify. Many of them we use for natives, but for instance, Illinois Wildflowers has some great descriptions on common weeds that you'll see in Illinois. You can see on the screen right here, Daucus carota, Queen Anne's lace, or wild carrot. That's something that we're all very familiar with, and it's one of those old world invasives. This is also one of those things that is commonly misused in native plantings. Fertilizer, food or foe. The use of fertilizer can facilitate a healthy planting if you use it right. And I wanted to cover this in particular because when you're planting from seed, don't throw out turf fertilizer. You're not planting turf, you know. Chances are you're going to be benefiting the weeds and giving them a lot of help, you know, beating out your planting. Instead, you know, try and facilitate the trajectory of your plantings by using a soil drench that's going to benefit the soil communities. Also, when you're planting live plants, you know, don't burn your new plants by you know, drenching them with fertilizer. Instead, put something that's like a slow release tablet, like Osmocote, underneath your plugs or quartz. Summary. Sad truth is that sometimes our plantings don't go as we plan, and that doesn't mean that you should give up on it. But watch your plantings, see what works and what doesn't work. Plant according to you know, what you see around you, and the best garden guide is just observing the world as it is. You know, seeing what's thriving despite, you know, all the adversity. And I think that a healthy planting is probably just as beautiful as a well-designed planting. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Trevor. Oh. So I think, to keep us on pace here. Oh, Trevor, why don't you, would you mind stop sharing if you can? And I think to keep us on pace here, I'm going to suggest that, Trevor, why don't you jump in the Q&A there and answer these several questions that we have open for the folks there in that Q&A. And I also just wanted to let folks know that we found out earlier that Brooke figured out how to preserve the Q&A so that we can keep a record of the questions and the answers. So thank you to Brooke for that, and we'll make sure that we record all of those answers and get them out to you. And it looks like Trevor had some links in his presentation there that specifically answered one of the questions in there, and so we'll make sure that we get those presentations out to you as well. So I'd like to turn it over to Christine Favilla, who will talk to us about seedling ID. And Christine, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen.
Sure thing. If I can get the correct one here. All right, is everybody able to see that? Good.
Yep.
So for those that have already been planting native plants, whether it's been, just this fall or a couple of years ago, you're probably already walking around and looking to see what's coming up. At least I am. And I've counted, it looks like 13 so far that I know are out there. But that's from really just kind of digging in a lot. And there's a lot of information to go through to try and figure out what is out there, what you have, maybe what the weeds are, what the natives are. So I just put together some slides that really highlights my two favorite books and my two favorite phone apps. There are a lot of other ways you can go about it. I really liked that Trevor listed a lot of the resources out there for identifying weeds. I don't have much on that in my presentation. I do really like the common backyard weeds of the upper Midwest. You can find that on Amazon for about $12. So just going to go ahead and get started. My absolute favorite is from the Natural Resource Conservation Service. I got this book. It is a little flip book. It fits in your hand, kind of a little bit larger than an index card would. It's laminated, very well put together. It has 42 different species. It definitely shows you all of the seedling stages from its very first pair, the single cotyledons, all the way up to the juvenile stages. I'm going to show you a little bit of an inside look. So the Rutabekia, which I already see coming up in my yard in several places, it does like to move around. So sometimes it'll surprise you where it pops up. The pictures are just very clear. They've got, a ruler set next to most all of them to show you exactly what size you should be looking for. Clearly depicting if it has hairs, if it's variegated, if it's narrowly tapered off, it's got edges. So this is actually 2 pages. Most of those 42 species have at least 2 pages dedicated to them as you flip through. This is a book that you can find online if you have time and want to just look at it as a PDF. It is free. It's out there for you to peruse. Online, it's actually 92 pages. I have the website here. That's probably not a live link. I'd be happy to copy it and put it in the chat for you though. You used to be able to purchase it from the Missouri Prairie Foundation, who is our main sponsor. They're out of stock right now. I'm not sure if they're getting any more back. But you can purchase it on Amazon as well. It's $27. Mine currently has been lent out to someone and I need to figure out who I lent it to. So if you're in the audience, please let me know. My second favorite one, actually no order in particular, is the Tallgrass Prairie. It's the Tallgrass Prairie Center Guide to Seeds and Seedling ID in the upper Midwest. It has 30 more species. and there are a lot more grasses and sedges in this particular book. This is kind of like your tree identification books, where you start with, you know, your answer and a key. Does it have 2 leaves? What, you know, what do the basal leaves look like? And then you go to the next page. It's very useful to try and distinguish it from lookalikes because it is so very clear and you're following its lead through. So this is just what 2 pages of what it looks like inside if you're looking up bottle gentian. I did try to make sure I had the same species, but I didn't end up with those in my presentation, so I apologize. But as you can see, it's just like going through a tree guide. You start with a visual inspection. You're going to choose A or B if there is a stem present or a stem absent. Then you're going to go to the next step. And you know, the edge stems, if it's a 3-edge stem, that's probably going to be one of your sedges. If it's a 4-edge stem, that's going to be one of your mints. But this guide is really good about just bringing you through it all. And it does have the colored pictures. And something that has a little bit different is it shows the seed size. And I think that is really useful, especially if you are going to a seed swap and you're not quite sure if you got a cultivar or if you have an actual native plant. Those I can only find online. I've not seen any free PDF sources. I would recommend going through the Missouri Prairie Foundation. They're $14. Prairie Moon is, you know, it's a wonderful company. I have just got their seed book in last week and have been going through it myself. It's just a couple more dollars through them. And apps. This actually is in opposite order. My favorite one is the second one I'll talk about. I just recently got this one to try it out and it works really well. I was able to identify most all of the seedlings through it appropriately. So I'm still on my 7-day trial. I think it's going to be worth it. I'm going to go ahead and spring for the $29 a year. Picture this. I mean, both of these apps can be found on, you know, Google Play or the Apple Store. And this is what it looks like when you're searching for it. There are different levels you can buy. I mean, the basic one, I think, is it really has everything you would need. So I just took a picture, you know, so on the left-hand side is a screenshot of what my camera took a picture of. That's my tussock sedge. It pulled up some Pennsylvania sedges, and then it goes through a list of others, and then you can click on those and start really comparing what you think it is or isn't. Now, if you've planted it, you probably know what you've planted, but if you have several of them, this will help you decide if it's a sedge or, you know, shoot, maybe it's just some grasses in there and you aren't familiar with them. So you'll be able to tell the difference through this app. And then iNaturalist, that's my favorite. It's free. I like it because it's basically a citizen science app. It's open source data. I utilize it all the time. From my house, as the crow flies, I think I'm 4 or 5 miles away from the Nature Institute. I can get on, and when I identify something, I can see that they've identified that exact same species as well. So it's really neat to see what's going on in your neighborhood, and you can zoom out anywhere on the map, anywhere you'd like to go. And this is how it looks. Once again, on the left, that's just my phone screenshot. I looked at the exact same thing, my tussock sedge. And on the right-hand side is what it pulls up. It pulls up a variety of them. You click on the little I for more information. It goes into more detail so that you can choose what it is. And then once you choose it, that's when it puts the pinpoint on the map. And so anybody else can see that you have that in your backyard, or if you're at the park. There's a lot of bio blitzes that I really highly recommend that you get involved in. Sure, there's plenty throughout Madison and St. Clair County, and I know that there's a lot of individuals that are from all over the world on this call right now. But if you start looking up for bio blitzes, it really helps you get out, see the community, what's available, what are native, what are not, and just adds to that database, which I think is very important. And I believe that's the end of mine. I didn't put the weed ones in, and I know afterwards, Grow Native is going to make sure that all of the resources are available for the people on the webinar. And so the list that Trevor had will be available as well. And those had some nice hyperlinks to them.
Awesome. Thank you, Christine.
Yeah.
And we had a comment from Shelly Shipley that one of the resources you mentioned is potentially available at the Missouri Department of Conservation for less than $10. So I'm not sure exactly which one that is, but if she types that in the chat, I'll be sure to let you know.
That is great.
So,
thank you.
Awesome. So that brings us to our final presentation of the night. I'm not seeing any open questions in the Q&A. So it looks like we're a couple minutes ahead of schedule now. We caught all the way back up, and we've got Scott Moss on. Good thing we caught up, because we got Scott Moss coming up. So
my reputation for being long-winded precedes, right?
So he'll be talking about getting started, seedling versus established, and kind of managing the changing shape of your garden. So, before you go, Scott, Shelly replied back, the seedling ID guide is available through Missouri Department of Conservation. So check that out. All right. Looks like we're good to go. So Scott, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you. And again, welcome for everyone doing this. I'm always amazed at how much I learn just from my fellow panelists as I go through these things. And so this is always beneficial from a number of directions. So kind of in bringing this thing kind of to its conclusion, I'm going to go at this, and I love to teach from examples. And so we're going to talk about sort of taking everything that we've used, learned so far, and applying that to some actual sites. And so we're going to talk about getting started, and we've already addressed some of these topics of the decision between starting from seed versus using plugs, or kind of going more with established plants into more established sites. And of course, then sort of once you have that thing, once you have these natives, we all know that sort of how difficult it is to access these things. And so we're going to talk a little bit about sort of managing the, again, I don't know how everybody else landscapes. I just know the madness that is my constantly changing system. And I'm always moving, and I'm always transplanting, and I'm always changing and replacing things. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that works. And so this is kind of a big eye chart, but it sets the stage for everything that I'm planning on talking about. The use of seed. And so this kind of left-right format's going to go through this entire sort of short presentation. But this is sort of the catch-all that explains sort of the starting point for how you would attack this problem. When you're talking about seed is always going to be sort of the lowest cost install method. So really, it sort of, it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can buy a lot of different species in these mixes, and you can custom mix them, or you can buy the pre-established mixes. And generally, for the price, you're going to get the best biodiversity and options when you come into this thing. Of course, it's a self-arranging system. You put the seed down, the seed's going to germinate. It's going to grow in the best ecological conditions for that. So that gives you unlimited sort of options. But again, it's not going to be the arranged, cultivated landscape. So you always have to consider that trade-off when you go in. As Trevor talked about, the site prep is generally pretty simple. We just got to get rid of the things that we don't want that are already there. Now, simple is always a relative thing. We kind of came in and we talked about the removal of turf. Removal of turf is always a complicated thing. It gets even more complicated when you start mixing the grasses that are in that turf. And so the examples that I'm going to show you from what I've been doing with this last year, there's Bermuda grass is in there, and that is a notorious problem that we run into with these sorts of installations. You can use this in large or small areas. I use seed mixes in some really small areas, and I've had tremendous success. But again, I'm not known for highly cultivated landscapes. My stuff tends to be a little bit on the naturalized wild side. And then one of the best things I love about seed is that you can do it. You can go at this thing in sort of phases. You can come in. Trevor referred to this basically, and mentioned it, but you can go in and you can plant in that time window that he referred to. Sometimes it's best to sort of let the forbs get a head start. And so you'll come in with your forb mix sort of in the fall leading into winter, and you'll come back in the spring and you can throw your grasses, your native grasses, warm season grasses down. And that generally is a really good way to kind of go at this thing with seed. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in your approach. This is going to be more natural. It's going to be less planned. So this is going to be subject to, the tolerance of your neighbors and the space that you have to work with. And the prep time, as again, Trevor referenced earlier, and the timing of the events, how you approach this and the amount of time that you're allowed to spend doing it is absolutely going to be critical to your success. This is not generally I'm going to take that patch of 12 by 15 area and I'm going to landscape it with a native garden and I'm going to do it next weekend. That's just not the way this thing works. And so if you're sort of on that, I have to have I want a native planting there, but I want it there right now, then you're going to switch over and you're going to go with the other alternative more than likely. And so when you start working with the other varieties, the plugs, I'm a huge fan of bare roots when you can get them. And of course, the potted plant varieties, the cost is going to go up proportionally. Again, this becomes dependent on a lot of things, availability and the size and the amount of effort that the growers put into this thing. But your opportunity here is to arrange and organize and to order the landscape and to create a cultivated landscape more along the lines of what most people expect when they see a landscape, especially in a residential neighborhood. The other benefit to this is that you're going to get what you put in the ground. And if you have any sense for starting the plants and you've got any sense for gardening at all, and I assume that the majority of people on this particular discussion panel and listening in are all going to kind of fall into that category, then you're going to get pretty good results. These things are going to come, you buy them from a reputable source, they're going to come healthy, you're going to get them into the right conditions, and as long as you take care of them, you're going to get really good establishment out of these things. So while you're going to spend a little more money doing this, your success rate is probably, for knowing what you've put in the ground and then being able to, as Christine referenced, identify it and know what was supposed to be there, you're going to have a much higher success rate here. I think the site prep, when you work in this direction, generally becomes a little bit more significant because you are going to be disrupting soil and you're going to be putting a lot more into this. And when you put mature live plants into the ground, there's going to be a lot more effort, not in the prep, but also in the follow-on things that are going to have to take place. You can still phase this thing. Again, I don't know that I've ever installed a plug planting all in one group. Again, I tend to kind of say I focus one direction and I come back and I realize maybe I'll go this way. And I'm more probably known for redesigning landscapes than designing landscapes. And so it gives you a lot of flexibility again on your installation. Depending on what you're choosing, you choose any number of ways to install this thing. Again, I tend to be more restoration focused, so I'm not known for being out there digging nice big holes and fertilizing. It tends to be a planting bar or something similar like to that, and I put things in the ground very quickly. But this is, I highly recommend if you're working in a smaller area, especially if you want to keep it reasonably cultivated in its appearance, then this is going to be your better option. And so this is an area that I started on last year. This is an area, I've got a concrete pad that kind of goes down towards the lake. Again, I apologize. Again, anybody who knows me knows that, there's constant rearrangement going on with my landscaping. So, you see the materials that I tend to work with all kind of stacked in the back by this thing. But this is a very small area. It's maybe 18 feet by 8 feet. It's not a real big area. And it's in an area with drainage that kind of moves through it. So I want to make sure I stabilize this site. And the big problem is that it was a community of mostly Bermuda grass. And the old joke adage, we talk about it all the time, is the surest way to get rid of Bermuda grass in your yard is a for sale sign. Well, I look at things like challenge accepted. And so I did a lot of reading, did a lot of research. I wish there was something I could recommend to you that absolutely works 100%, but there is nothing. No targeted herbicides. There's a lot of things that are better than others, but it's not a lot of targeted herbicides. So I just went back to the old fashioned. And, the one thing that you'll see in the literature is that if you hit Bermuda grass in the flowering stage, so late in the summer, early in the fall, then with a pretty potent level, a mix of glyphosate, then you will get pretty good results. And so this has kind of been a challenge because it backs to a lake. So I've had to be really careful. But at this point now, with a couple of applications, I'm feeling pretty confident about this. Again, we'll follow up with me in the summer and let me know how I did, because I have just now put my seed mix down, took the opportunity in the spring, and I've got my seed mix now installed in here. I went really heavy with Virginia wild rye and Canada wild rye, even though they're probably not going to be there long term because this is a very hot, dry, sunny spot. But those cooler season native grasses are going to behave as my cover crop. And then I put a mix that I bought online from an organization, a company in Kentucky, which I found to be a pretty good mix of seed that, you know, was easy. It was anyway. It looked like a pretty good mix to pop in there, but I custom mixed a lot of other things into this seed mix. And so this is all said, probably about 3 hours worth of work invested in it. And now the hard part starts, which is now we wait, right? So we wait and we watch and we monitor and we use adaptive management. And so as Trevor suggested and as Christine suggested, we are now going to be in the maintenance phase. I'll add a little piece, and this is just for anybody who's out there who wants to do this kind of planting. The 15-inch thing that Charlie referenced, the cutting off of the tops of the annuals to make sure they don't go to seed. The best tool that I have found for that is a hedge cutting attachment that I put on the end of my line trimmer. I just take the head of the line trimmer off. I put a hedge trimming attachment to it. It's about a 20-inch bar, and it acts like a big sickle. And I literally just cut this thing down at about 6 to 8 inches. And so that'll be the maintenance plan for this over the next 3 to 4 months as the annual stuff comes up, and it will. I'll just go out there and I'll just knock down the seed heads, and I'll just be looking in between those annuals that are popping up and watching for the germination of those small natives in both the grasses and the forbs. And of course, right on the other side of that concrete pad is what I intend for this thing to become. So you can see this is another area of the yard. You can see behind that. So we'll talk about this area and the one behind that in this photograph, because these are all areas that I've been working and or reworking. But this is the goal. It's a nice mix of right now I've left all the little blue stem, and there's some Indian grass, and there's a lot of native forbs that are in here that just don't really hold up to the winter, especially on that kind of dry slope. Backing down to the lake. So they're in there. You just can't see them standing right now, but they'll pop up and they'll start to really become prolific about June through the end of the growing season. And so this is the goal. And that's again, just another small area. This is another very small area. There's another one on the backside of that, which I have burned off this year. So I burned off these 2 areas this year because I'm doing some adjustments to the seed mixes and the planting that's gone in there. But again, I'm constantly sort of in flux. So this is an area was originally started from seed. When we have this debate with seed versus plugs, my argument is always, why not both? And so I've really sort of settled into a phase where I start with a seed mix. And then as that starts to establish, I will go in and I'll plug into small areas. We do the same thing in restoration. I call it pollinator islands. And I take my key pollinator plants, usually 12 or 15 of them at a time, and I plug them into sort of concentrated islands that I can focus my attention on and really sort of baby them along to increase biodiversity. And so that's the process that I used here. And it really, I mean, even people who have no idea what native planting is and what it's all about, when they see this particular area of the yard, they always comment about it just because it looks so different and so dramatic from everything that's around it. And so this is the next project. This is a retaining wall, again, backing down to the same lake that we installed. This was actually at my neighbor's house, who likes me and I guess at least trusts me enough to let me take over this process for him. And so he's got a pretty tough slope here. It was excess spoil soil from the building of all this construction that we did over at his house last year. And it's horrible soil. It's mostly clay that's been turned up. You can see it's mixed in with an awful lot of fescue that's coming back that was still kind of embedded in that soil when it was used to kind of finish off this retaining wall. And so that process is now underway. As Trevor said, we went out and I applied glyphosate, did it a little differently here. I wiped glyphosate onto this thing. So rather than spray it, again, you can spray and you can do it up here in the right wind and be really cautious. But again, just being ultra cautious about the environment around and not wanting to spray glyphosate into the water. And I didn't have, again, there are mixtures that you can apply right here, Shore Clear and a few others, Roundup Custom, that are made to be applied by these aquatic systems. But I didn't have that. I just had regular old glyphosate that was sitting around in the house. And so I literally took a towel and stuck it on it because I'm missing a herbicide wiper somewhere. And and I dragged a towel with glyphosate sprayed on it across all these plants. I looked like a madman when I'm not doing these things. Most of my neighbors think I'm nuts anyway. But so far I haven't had a chance. It's only been a week-ish, but I'm starting to see that it's starting to work. So this was the pictures that I took last week when I was using this as an example. And that will get an in. I'll start off with a simple mix, mostly with the Virginia wild rye and Canada wild rye, which I tend to prefer in these settings for a cover crop. I use annual rye a lot in these kind of systems. And again, given the time of the year, I might have to go in there with some annual rye to get that started. But that basically makes me have to go in and regularly, about every 2 weeks, have to kind of cut this thing down so that I don't just grow a crop of annual rye all the time. And so by fall of this year, I'll be ready to put the forbs down, and I'll put a good mix of forbs onto this slope. Again, fortunately, my neighbor is very willing to let me experiment with his little patch of soil here. And then probably the following spring, I'll come back in, and just because I kind of know him and I know what his expectations are going to be, and I know how much he sort of admires these banks of little blue stem that I've created all in my yard, that's going to be a place where I go in and I'm going to plug in, just pull out about 8 or 10 little blue stems out of my yard, split them up, and I'm going to scatter them through there in a way that really kind of gives it a good effect. And so that sort of leads us to that question. So seed obviously is a really good way to go about this, but the options for other things, the plugs and the potted plants they're too good to be passed up. And so again, it's a perfect point to kind of plug all the native plant sales that are about ready to start. Certainly we've got one that we do every year out of the college, and there are a number of people who are and organizations that are selling native plants and putting a lot of time and effort into this so that this becomes much more accessible. 20 years ago, when I was starting to first dabble in this thing in landscaping, you couldn't buy native plants. If you asked for native plants, people would look at you like you had two heads. And now it's the thing, right? It's many people looking for them. You could probably get 6 or 8 or 10 varieties of native plants at Lowe's and Home Depot at this point. And so this is really becoming a much more available thing. And so you guys probably are all familiar with the different variations, again, the different potted plants. I'm a real big fan of sort of these 38 plugs. I generally buy a lot of them from Trevor at Pure Natives every year. And so these generally are easy to work with, and they have really good establishment rates. And, again, I highly recommend, there's a lot of people out there that will sell you even these plug trays. This is one of this might be a 96, but they'll sell you ones that are already pre-mixed. So the little sort of native garden in a box that goes in, just remember that this is not a lot of space being covered here. But the results are remarkable. When you take one of these, sort of native plug systems and you install it, especially in a controllable kind of concentrated area, then you can really get remarkable results. I tend to advocate for planting in clumpings or groups. When you plant one butterfly weed by itself, you're 5 years from seeing anything dramatic and remarkable. So I have a tendency to put 3 of them kind of in together so that you get of that color, and you tend to get quicker, more dramatic results out of that. But again, that's my style, and it doesn't mean that you have to go that way. And so this is the last piece I want to talk about, because when we talked about working with the changing or the shape of your garden, when I hear that description, what I'm thinking is the evolution of your garden. Your native planting is going to be different from sort of a traditional cultivated place, in that it's going to determine the direction it goes. And so you're going to get things in there that work and things that don't work. And so these are both areas where I already have an established native plant community I've had for several years in these areas. And it just was getting to the point where it wasn't working. So it does tend, when it's working, when native systems are functioning the way we expect them to function, they're going to start recruiting things. They're going to start recruiting things from the local landscape, and they're going to start recruiting things from far away that you don't necessarily want. And so I had gotten to a point with both of these where they had gone beyond even my tolerance for sort of the wild and crazy native stuff. And so this year, again, apologies to Charlie and the native bees. I did leave about 50% of the stuff that's in my yard standing, but this just had to go, and it had to go early so I could get on this thing. But I started off probably end of February with a burn. I use, you can see where the synthetic putting green that I installed several years ago before, when I was naive and thought my kids were going to become golf pros. I tend to singe the side of that a little bit. That's why these blocks have gone in there, so I don't set the entire synthetic turf on fire. But I burn this thing off, and it does a great job of removing all the excess vegetation. And so now I'm in the process literally of reworking this. And that started much the way that I do a lot of my other work. I started off with a seed mix, something that kind of made sense, that I wanted to make sure I had representative species from the things I'm interested in. And then I'm going to come back and enter the maintenance phase. And part of my maintenance phase for these, especially as I'm reworking, is to really focus on the things that I don't want. So I'm going to be looking for things like switchgrass. I had a ton of switchgrass that just sort of took over this place. It's just not a big enough space for plants like switchgrass. I teach a class in native plants in the landscape, and I used to recommend switchgrass as a native grass. Unless you have a gigantic space for it, it's not the right thing. So we're going back in, have a heavy mix here of little blue stem and side oats grama and buffalo grass and all kinds of things that are short, warm season grasses. And then honestly, to give myself sort of the kick in the pants and the immediate flush again, so that the wife is happy and the neighbors are happy, I put in a huge amount of black-eyed Susans. And so again, this is sort of experimental, but I'm trying to use black-eyed Susans as that sort of quick method of soil control and ground coverage, so that I can start coming back in and reworking this into some of the diversity that I enjoy. And again, John Wingo always jokes about the prairie establishment, how it goes through these phases, and one of the phases is the Monarda black-eyed Susan phase. Well, when he said that to me one day, that kind of lit a light in my head. Why not use that as sort of an establishment phase? And they're natives, they do all the things we expect out of natives, and yet both of those are easy to establish, and they grow up pretty quickly. And while they can become pretty dominant, it's nothing that a little bit of a 2,4-D won't kind of be useful in altering the community structure. And so I'm doing that with both of these sites. There's a lot of stuff that's going to come back up in here. One of the things that I'll do is that I will salvage anything that I don't necessarily want in the place that it's at. I'll dig it out. I'll pop it into my little raised garden bed. I have a raised garden where I convinced myself that I'm going to grow tomatoes and peppers. But honestly, what it is for me is just it's the establishment place for my native transplants. I dig stuff up, I pop it into that great soil in the raised garden bed. I cultivate it for a month or so, and then I split it up and I put it back into the landscape. And so it really is nothing but a giant propagation box for me. And I'll rearrange this thing, and I'll start giving it a little more structure, something along the lines of what I sort of had envisioned when I installed these things 3 to 5 years ago. And so again, this, as Trevor said, this is an endeavor in love and patience. It's never going to go the way you plan, but it's always going to go in a direction that, at least when you're using natives, is going to be positive. Certainly, way more positive than the alternatives of sort of the traditional non-native cultivated landscapes. Oops. And again, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the results, when you stop and think about it, they're spectacular. And so this is that site that you were just the one from previous that you saw the standing little blue stems. This is what it looks like in the spring. And so this in a month is what I'm going to be looking at out in that particular area. It's a series of kind of sand dunes that I created. This is a garden bed that I use. It's right by the bay window of my house, where I have about 15 different species of very kind of rare native plants. This is a spider lily. This is a Michigan lily. And so again, I can't say enough. Anybody who is resistant to the use of native plants just hasn't seen their full potential. Because it's worth it, honestly, absolutely. So that's all I got, Nate. So I'm sending it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Looks like we've got one question in the white flowers in the middle pick. I think you just answered it, but would you mind repeating it? The spider lily, I think you said.
Spider lily, Hymenacalis.
All right.
If I ever figure out how to cultivate it, propagate it, I'll sell you lots of them.
We got a couple thank yous. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. So now I guess it's kind of free for all time. If you have any other native plant questions you want to throw in the Q&A there, we'll kind of tackle them as we can. Any recommendations for wetland areas?
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's directed at anyone in particular, but Trevor will be able to handle that one really well because he's becoming an expert in sedges. But that Hymenacalis that everybody just saw, that's actually a wetland plant. I grow it in a garden bed next to my house. But, my favorites for those kind of wet areas, copper iris, cardinal flower, and, if you can get your hands on some of those specialty things like that, spider lily, there's a number of these things that are out there.
Yeah, there's one of my favorite to use in a wet area that's actually probably one of the fastest growing sedges, Carex vulpinoidea, brown fox sedge. Carex annectans is another good one, and Carex stipata. Some of the finer bladed sedges establish pretty quickly. There are actually quite a few rushes as well that, and you'll see them growing in ditches along railroads, but they can be used effectively in plantings also. So green bulrush, Scirpus atrivirens is a great one. Some of the short-lived perennials too that get overlooked. You mentioned cardinal flower, but blue lobelia is absolutely stunning, and it will, given the right circumstances, it will flower in the first year and readily self-seed.
I really like
another.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I thought you were done. Sorry.
I was going to say the other one that I really like too is that doesn't get utilized frequently is monkey flower. So Mimulus rengens is a really cool looking plant as well.
I'll have to check that out. I've never heard of it. I have some areas that aren't exactly wetland, but they do tend to continue to be wet throughout the year. And I really like my just the swamp rose mallow and then marsh milkweed. I have found that swamp or marsh milkweed is what I get most monarchs on in my yard.
Me too. Well, looks like Trevor's answering one in the Q&A there by typing. So I'll move to the next one. Good native wind blocks for dwarf trees and full sun.
All right, so let me make sure I ask some questions about that one. So we got full sun, but we want native wind blocks and dwarf trees. So, red osier dogwood, they'll be multi-stemmed. I'm trying to think of good, easy multi-stemmed shrubs. Common ninebark. Common ninebark would be a good one as well. So those really aren't dwarf trees, but they'll be multi-stemmed, and so they'll create a pretty good wind block for you.
Witch hazel is a good one too. And if it's full sun and really dry, shrubby St. John's wort is another nice one. It doesn't get quite as tall, but it does well in some pretty terrible soils.
Oh, he says dwarf trees are fruit. And then, Trevor, I don't know if you answered this one. Can you name some of your favorite plant combinations for dry prairie areas? You're muted.
Typically, I am muted. for dry areas, so one of the things that I like to use is I like to kind of go with a typical glade type planting. So shorter species. I really like the purple poppy mallow. I also am a big fan of a lot of the native milkweeds that don't get utilized a lot. So, you know, Asclepias viridis, things of that nature. Spotted bee balm is another one that does well in dry areas that doesn't get utilized a lot. That's Monarda punctata, and it's a really cool looking flower if you get a chance to see it. I also like some of the underutilized Blephilias. So you got to be careful here because we have two common Blephilias, Hirsuta and Ciliata. And Ciliata typically occurs in wetter areas, whereas Hirsuta will occur in drier areas. But I think it typically will occur more in shade, drier shade than full sun. There's also a lot of dry grasses that get underutilized. So we actually have a pretty good range of cool season grasses that will establish quicker than some of the warm season. Prairie June grass is one of my favorites that does great in dry areas. It's a really attractive seed head and is a cool season grass, so it will grow readily within the first 2 years.
Scott, you want to take this one about the native areas and city codes?
Yeah, that was Diana who asked that question. I love this question. We talk about this a lot in the sustainable landscaping. And so, you know, the interesting thing about these city codes is they put things that are sort of very generic. You described a very generic thing where, you know, you have to have a 6-inch grass height guidance. But then I think you had your answer sort of right there in the question where you said you grow a lot of things that are in flower beds. So I also live in a neighborhood, and I continue to sort of keep adding more and more and more of these native plantings into my landscape. And the big difference, the thing that seems to have kept me out of trouble, is that you have to identify them if it's a flower bed. And so I generally do that by at least doing a simple cutback. And then if necessary, I raise the soil level just a little bit above grade. And at that point, it's on anybody else, and it becomes a very opinion-based thing, whether or not that's my yard or whether that's a flower bed. So I have typically sort of done very well with this and not gotten in any trouble because I don't just go in and take the flat grade of my yard and just convert it to natives. That site there along the concrete pad that I just showed you guys will be really one of the first ones that'll not be in that category. So I see this argument, you know, and you see those stories pop up on the news periodically where people get in trouble for this. Again, what it comes down to that concept of 6 inches of grass height versus what constitutes a landscape bed. And so I just put a small border, or I put a small cutback, or I tend to landscape that are in amongst a lot of trees as well. So I have a tendency to put a lot of structure. Everything that I do has shrubs and some small trees that are with it. And I just identify them as landscape beds, and really nobody bats an eye about it.
One of the things that makes it clear it's a garden is, as Scott said, doing something that makes intentionality clear, that it's not just something, oh yeah, I forgot to mow around that particular spot. So anything that defines it as a different kind of area, a border, even a grass border that's cut very, very cleanly, or even just some old logs around the front of it. Anything that says this is the end of grass and the start of a garden really helps.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
So find better neighbors.
Oh, there's one here in the chat I want to read. Are there grasses you'd suggest for an area that gets that takes on water during rain? So I guess they're saying that, you know, the water runs across this area of their backyard, and it kind of accumulates there in one spot when it rains.
It would depend on the amount of water and how long it stays there. So if it's just a temporary thing, any of these shorter grasses, I mean, I use little blue stem a lot just because of the shape it gets, but most of them will be tolerant of short exposures to water. And with fibrous root systems, we'll generally do a pretty good job of sort of holding soil and sort of taking the brunt of that flow. But if it's really powerful water flow where it's going to sit for any long lengths of time, then you'll probably have to adjust that. And again, sedges and rushes that are sort of more tolerant of those conditions would probably be the better way to go.
Got one here in the Q&A. What are some good sources for pots to make your own plugs? And how about trays?
Well, I mean, if nobody else is going to tackle that one, I know what I do is.
Yeah, I was going to say Hummerts International.
Yeah, you can go right to Hummerts and shop with them. But what I do is when I buy plants from Trevor or any of the other number of sources that I use, I save those trays and I reuse them, repurpose them, year after year. As long as you're careful with them, you can generally get 3 or 4 years out of those things. But again, if you want to buy them brand new, Hummerts over in Earth City is a really good source. But the Greenhouse Mega Store, I buy a lot of stuff nowadays from them just online, just because the convenience factor, and they generally have pretty good pricing. But there's a lot of those commercial outlets where you can buy that. Just look for a plug tray 38 is what it's generally called, or star 38s.
Any experience transplanting white sage? Luke planted it last year as a plug and it grew about 3 feet in diameter. This year it's looking like it'll be 6 or 7 feet.
I'm not familiar with that one, but if it sounds like it's rhizomatous or it spreads pretty quickly. And if that's the case, then just divide it up like any other plant. It'll probably do pretty well. Trevor, are you familiar with that one?
Muted.
I know, I do it every time. No, I mean, I haven't had as much experience with the white sage, but I was trying to read it, and then I keep getting out of it. But yeah, if it's anything like Salvia azurea, then yeah, it can get fairly tall. Generally, they top out at about 5 to 6 feet, though, I would say.
Trevor, while you're unmuted there, where is the Pure Air facility? Is it a place people can go, or?
Oh, no. I mean, you can with an appointment. My office is in St. Louis, West Florissant, across from Bell Fountain Cemetery. Our greenhouses are located in Wentzville, Missouri. We have 2 greenhouses. Our greenhouse manager is Pat Mahone, and he will talk your ears off if you ever want to talk about orchids, because he is infatuated with them.
Trevor, will Pure Air Natives have things for sale at the Nature Institute's Wildflower Market?
Yes. So the plan is for me to work it, and I talked with Pat about that, and we're hoping to be able to offer some really cool rare plants. In particular, I believe we're going to try and offer Trifolium reflexum, buffalo clover. So it's one of our few native Trifolium species.
Got one more in the Q&A here. How big of an area are you talking about, Scott, for using the switchgrass? Can it be used in a rain garden to control erosion?
Actually, if it's a containerized or contained type rain garden, then that's probably one of the better places. The thing about switchgrass that I have found now after, 10 or 12 years of using it is that it is a very successful producer of seed, and it self-recruits. And so when you plant one of them, even if it's, I planted them in just sort of a couple of key areas on top of mounds, what I end up with is literally dozens of them. And again, just because it self-seeds and grows after a couple of years, that's still a 5 foot, 6 foot tall plant that it's a foot in diameter. It just tends to exclude. It's very competitive. It tends to exclude everything. So if you're using it in a rain garden and it's pretty much the thing that you're going to use to dominate that rain garden, which would be a pretty good choice for it, then yeah, it would certainly work very well. And there's some great cultivars of it that you can get with a little bit of color and difference in structure. You get some smaller, when you say smaller, that's relative, compact versions that only grow about 5 feet. There's a heavy steel variety that I really like, has a kind of a silvery gray look to it at times. But yeah, what I have just found is in some of these spaces that I'm talking about that I use in my yard are large. When you think of cultivated gardens, they're relatively large, and switchgrass just dominates them. And we have problems with switchgrass and smaller prairies kind of taking over as well. So again, with switchgrass, kind of use it with that disclaimer.
I'd like to add to that too. If you do decide to go with a USDA variety, because there are natural selections that occur for a lot of grasses. One of the really popular ones now that you see circulating is Cave and Rock, because it was first identified in Cave and Rock, Illinois. But for wet areas, there are switchgrass varieties that thrive in wet areas versus dry areas. So if you have a dry area and you're wanting to populate it with switchgrass, I would probably use a variety like Blackwell, whereas in wetter areas, a variety like Canlo is going to thrive.
Trevor, we lost you right there at the right before you said in the wetter areas. I think you had made a plant recommendation right before that.
Yeah, the variety of switchgrass was Canlo, and it's a USDA variety, but it gets a little bit taller, but it does the best in wetter areas for naturally occurring varieties.
What about switchgrass variety Shenandoah? Got any experience with that one? That
is a horticultural variety. Yeah, it is. It's very attractive, but there are. It just depends on if you're looking for aesthetics versus natural benefits. Some of you gotta be careful with some of them. Shenandoah and is one of those horticultural varieties that's really popular. It does get shorter and it gets a beautiful red color in the fall.
All right. Well, I think we've come to the end of our questions. So I guess I'll give a shout out to all of our panelists here tonight. Thank you to Charlie Pitts and Trevor Bennett and Christine Favilla and Scott Moss. Thank you to Brooke Widmer for hosting us tonight and being our record keeper. And just wanted to make sure I gave it another minute for any other questions, but it looks like we're all done. So thank you again. And if you registered with an email address, be on the lookout for that. We'll send the presentations and hopefully a recorded Q&A for you to reference later. And good luck out there. Take care, everybody.